Ed77 here. Anita's just uploaded her latest project, and just gonna pick apart some of her points here.
If you want to get to know a character, learn about their interests, goals, or desires, their butt is probably not going to give you that information. It won't tell you much about who they are or what they're thinking or feeling at any given time. But video game designers often choose to put tremendous focus on the butts of certain characters while going to almost absurd lengths to avoid calling attention to the butts of others. These carefully crafted choices developers make about camera angles and clothing significantly impact how players think about and relate to these characters.
Not so. I'll use Joanna Dark as my example here. In Perfect Dark, she isn't overly sexualized as such, but I can still relate to her in the same way I could Lara Croft. Having her ass on display doesn't make a whole lot of difference. Having played both games, I could easily say people could relate to both of them. Both of them are smart, have a sense of adventure, are strong, and are independent.
Third-person games with female protagonists typically display those characters in a way that gives players a full-body view. A classic example of this is the original Tomb Raider games, which are presented from a third-person perspective wherein protagonist Lara Croft's entire body is visible. In these early Tomb Raider games, Lara's butt is typically right in the center of the screen, a camera orientation which, along with the sexualized clothing the designers choose to outfit her in, places a tremendous amount of emphasis on that part of her body.
Certainly not your best example here. Lara's butt is quite some distance away. Not to mention the graphics at the time were certainly not as detailed as they were today. And even your most hormone-fueled teenage boy knew a real woman wouldn't ever have a body like that. Lara doesn't seem much different from Cloud Strife in that respect. Let's not forget the camera angles in many places of Tomb Raider were awful, so it's not like all the attention was actually on her butt.
In dozens of third-person games with playable female characters, the character's butt is brought to the forefront, and that's where the player's focus is directed. In Batman Arkham City, for instance, the player's gaze is drawn to Catwoman's behind, which is emphasized by her costume and exaggerated hip sway.
Actually, Catwoman is more on the left, not on the center. We can see more of the city this way.
The ceremony! The Sisterhood will never forgive me if I am late.
Golden Axe Beast Rider makes extremely sure that we notice the protagonist's butt just before we take control and start playing.
Ah, not the back, the arms, or the legs then? I mean, they can be sexy, right?
And here, in Tomb Raider Underworld, to say that Lara's butt is being emphasized would be putting it mildly.
Incredible. The carvings are clearly similar to early Germanic design, but this is far older than the 5th century.
And this happens
Why revolve the camera around her whole body? Why not just zoom in?
all too often.
You can't miss it.
Let's contrast the way that women's butts are emphasized with the sometimes absurd lengths taken to cover up or hide men's butts. If some of this footage looks jerky, that's because in some games, trying to get a glimpse of male characters' butts can feel a bit like wrestling with the camera. Common ways men's butts are hidden are by preventing the player from seeing below the character's waistline, or employing a more over-the-shoulder camera angle, which has the added benefit of keeping the character's butt safely out of the frame.
You contradict this point later on in your video.
The most amusing solution is to simply include a cape, tunic, long coat, or very conveniently positioned piece of tattered fabric, which actively prevents the player from getting a clear or sustained look at the protagonist's butt. For the purposes of this video, I tried to get a glimpse of Batman's rear end, but it's as if his cape is a high-tech piece of Wayne Industries equipment designed to cover up his butt at all costs. I like to jokingly refer to this aspect of a male character's costume as the strategic butt covering.
You chose some rather awful examples here. Batman wears his trademark cape. Jedi or Sith typically wear robes. It wasn't uncommon for Italian men to wear choppers around that time period. The Belmont family, like many fictional vampire hunters, wear capes.
Of course, not all games with male protagonists keep the character's butt obscured or out of frame like these games do. The real issue is one of emphasis and definition. A significant portion of third-person games with female protagonists call attention to those characters' butts in a way that's meant to be sexually appealing to the presumed straight male player. In this regard, the way that women's bodies are depicted is significantly different from the way that men's bodies are depicted.
Really? What about Duke Nukem? His body is very much unrealistic. We do know, however, that Duke is a parody of masculinity, but nonetheless he is still depicted as a macho man.
There are a few examples of male protagonists who are wearing clothing that calls attention to their butts, but for the most part, men's butts, even when visible in the frame, are de-emphasized. Plenty of male heroes wear baggy pants or jeans, Uncharted's Nathan Drake among them, but nothing about his visual design or the jeans he's wearing encourages you to focus on his butt as some sort of defining aspect of his character.
Surely you're better off asking the female players of those games what they think.
By contrast, this emphasis on the butts of female characters communicates to players that this is what's important. This is what you should be paying attention to. It communicates that the character is a sexual object designed for players to look at and enjoy. And by explicitly encouraging you to ogle and objectify the character, the game is implicitly discouraging you from identifying directly with her. Strategic butt coverings and camera angles that obscure characters' rear ends are not an accident. They are a conscious decision made with great care, and the flip side of this is that designers often do the opposite when the protagonist is female. This difference in how male and female characters are framed often extends into the advertisements and box covers. Women's butts are front and center, and it's even become a depressing joke that their bodies are twisted and contorted in uncomfortable or unnatural ways so that their breasts and butt can be visible in the same shot. In contrast, when men are depicted from behind, there's great effort taken to cover up their rear end, often with other images or shadows.
Right, like it takes attention away from the other things that are important? What about the gameplay? Or the soundtrack? Maybe the story? We can identify with the characters in the same way we can identify with any other character, be they sexualized or not, in film, comics, books, and especially anime. Also, wasn't Bayonetta designed by a woman?
Of course, female characters can also be framed in ways that aren't objectifying. A good example of this is the episodic adventure game Life is Strange, in which the protagonist's butt isn't emphasized or centralized. The camera angles work in conjunction with the story to encourage us to identify with her as a human being. Sadly, the box art for the third-person action-adventure game Beyond Good and Evil emphasizes and sexualizes Jade's butt. The game itself, however, demonstrates that the Nathan Drake approach of outfitting a character in clothing that doesn't emphasize their butt and not having the camera center it or focus on it can work just as well to humanize female characters as it does for male characters.
Well, that's mainly about how the camera works. You can do the same in some Final Fantasy games, where the female characters can move freely and the camera is set in one place and not focused on them.
To be clear, the solution here is not to simply show more butts of male characters. Equal opportunity butt display is definitely not the answer. Rather, the solution is to de-emphasize the rear ends of female characters so that players are encouraged not to ogle and objectify these women, but to identify and empathize with them as people. This is not an impossible task, given that game designers do this all the time with their male characters. It's time they started consistently doing it with their female characters too.
No, not an impossible task at all. Why don't feminists and social justice warriors start doing their own games to achieve this? Maybe they already are. I mean, we don't all go and play every single indie game on Steam. Why not do more on the big budget titles? Recently, Anita put up a new post about there being an end in sight for these videos. How there is a change on redoing this project, and how this damsel in distress is in distress, and how depressed and upset she is. We'd think over these years and the money she gained we'd get better results than this. Well, I guess we'll have to see what's in store on her next video. Till then, later.